Okay, good morning. Let's get started. Welcome back. So, today we're going to move into a new field, which is international monetary cooperation. And as you will see, monetary politics is even more exciting than trade politics. But at the same time, we're going to rely on many of the theories and basic ways of approaching international economic affairs as we did in trade. So we're relying partially on the same theories, but we apply them to this new topic, monetary cooperation. This week will be, let me just quickly ask you something. Did you all receive the email about the evaluation of this course? Right, so please do that. Please complete that, that survey. That's really important. Okay. So, nonetheless, this week is a bit different from what we did in trade politics or in international trade cooperation, because this is one unified theory that is backing up the international, or that explains the international trading system. Now, the international monetary system, there was much more variation. And we talked already about how it evolved. We had the gold standard before the First World War. That gold standard was restored in the interwar period, and then it collapsed. And then we had the Bretton Woods system, which worked for a while, and then it collapsed, right? So we are drawing on different theories. So it's a mix of history and theoretical explanations that we're going to do today. Because we're going to use different aspects of our analytical framework to explain specific events in the history of the international monetary system, right? And what we're going to do is, I'm going to start with a quick introduction into the adjustment mechanisms, a review of the adjustment mechanisms that we already discussed in the second week when we talked about David Hume's price-BC flow model. And then we're going to apply this, or we're going to examine how this applies to the gold standard and why this adjustment mechanism worked in one period and why it didn't work didn't work well after the First World War. Then we're going to move in the second half of this week. We're going to discuss the Bretton Woods system, why it looked the way it looked, and one reason is that the key policymakers are trying to learn from the collapse and the defects of the gold standard. And one key actor here was Keynes. Then we're going to move on and discuss why this became so unstable and what the political factors were behind this. So why should we talk about monetary systems in the first place? And here is a statement that pretty much summarizes the motivation. And this is from an economic historian, Barry Eichengreen, who says that the international monetary system is the glue that binds national economies together. Nations find it difficult to efficiently exploit the gains from trade and foreign lending in the absence of an adequately functioning international monetary mechanism. So we cannot have a well-functioning trade system, which is what we discussed in the past 4 sessions, if we don't have a well-functioning monetary system. That's the whole point here. So what is a well-functioning monetary system? What are the functions that a system has to fulfill? Well, the first one is that it has to provide liquidity. So we have an international economy, and we need sufficient money in this international economy to finance trade and investment. And sometimes we have a liquidity shortage, especially during crisis. This is a situation in which I might not want to lend money to someone else because I fear that because if the system collapses, I'm not going to get this money back. And in this situation, we need a lender of last resort that provides liquidity to stabilize the system. That's the first task. The second one is to provide confidence. So we should have a system that makes investors confident that it's stable in the future. So that's related to the lender of last resort argument, right? If you, one of the most serious obstacles to trade is high volatility, for instance, in exchange rates. So you're not sure what the price of your good will be in the future. And the system should provide confidence, which means that there will be low uncertainty about future stability and limited volatility. And the third task that the system has to fulfill is to provide an adjustment mechanism. Again, this is related to confidence. If the adjustment mechanism doesn't work, or you question whether governments follow and implement the policies that are necessary for adjustment, then it destabilizes the system. And very specifically, this refers to imbalances, mostly current account imbalances. So we talked about this already last week when we talked about the Latin American debt crisis. So the current account is the most important component is the trade balance, but not only, there's also transfers from returns from income abroad or direct transfers. But the point is that if you have a trade deficit and you accumulate more and more debt, that eventually you need to adjust. You need to change the behavior. And the adjustment mechanism provides a mechanism that leads to the decline of a trade deficit or these imbalance, and which by definition means that some other country which is running a trade surplus also reduces the surplus. So we talked about adjustment mechanisms already, right? We talked about Hume's price-specie flow model, which is an adjustment mechanism under the gold standard, which is simply a fixed exchange rate system. So let's quickly review this. And this will be important in a moment to understand the politics behind the collapse of the gold standard. So suppose we have a current account deficit. What happens? So we did this in the second week of this course. What happens when we have a current account deficit? So you're importing more than you're exporting. Let's reduce it to the trade balance, right? What does it mean in terms of capital flows? Do you see a capital inflow or outflow? You have an outflow because you need to pay for these imports, and therefore the money is flowing out, right? So what's the consequence of this for the domestic economy? What does it mean for money supply? Money supply goes down, right? If capital is flowing out, there's less money in the domestic economy. There is an assumption here. What's the key assumption? Well, the central bank does not interfere and does not start to print money to offset this mechanism, right? That's crucial here. So once you have a fixed exchange rate system, the central bank basically is operating on an autopilot. It does not interfere with these processes. If anything, it tries to speed up this mechanism. And the effect here is that domestic prices decrease. If domestic prices decrease, there will be less output, right? Firms will produce less. So the economy, at least for a while, is pushed into recession. That's a key point here, right? What's the social consequences of this? Well, if you push the economy into recession, what should happen is that wages decrease, right? And that's the whole purpose here. Wages decrease, so the adjustment cost is paid by the workers. And that's where it becomes political, right? So if workers resist, all this becomes works less well. But because prices decrease, eventually exports go up and imports go down, which means that the trade deficit disappears. Okay? So we had that when we already talked about this, when we talked about Hume's model. But that's one way to do it. Now assume we have flexible exchange rates. We start from the same situation. We have a current account deficit, which means we have a capital outflow. What happens now? What happens now? How do you adjust? So if you import more than you export, there's more demand for the foreign currency. You demand that foreign currency, but nobody wants to buy your product, so there's less demand for your own currency, right? Which means that the price of your currency decreases, so the exchange rate declines. If the exchange rate declines, that means that your products on the world market are cheaper, and the products from another country at home become more expensive. So you demand them less, and foreign countries or foreign consumers demand your products more. So the exports increase, the imports decrease, and the current account deficit disappears again. But the mechanism is very different. Here you don't push the country into a recession, but you just adjust the exchange rate, which means that the foreign producers immediately pay a cost because you just change the relative prices, and therefore you start to export more, right? Now, in the end, the effect, in the long term, the effect is the same, right? But there's no recession, so the workers don't pay this cost, this adjustment cost. Your workers don't pay that cost. The workers abroad do, right? But your workers don't. Who pays for this, apart from the foreign workers? Who pays the cost if the exchange rate falls? Yeah. So capital owners are paying a cost, because at least those who invested abroad, or because the price of their investment also changes. Okay, so this will be important to understand the politics behind these systems, especially the change from the gold standard in the pre-1914 period to the return to the gold standard and its collapse in the interwar period. It also motivates the design of the Bretton Woods system, which originally was a very Keynesian arrangement, and then also its collapse later on. So what we have now in post-1973 period, so after the collapse of Bretton Woods in the 1970s, it's one could call it a non-system. There's no rules on a global level that all countries would have to follow. They can pick and choose their exchange rate system as they want it, and there's no centralized system today. So we're going to explain what countries do. We're going to explain that in the next week. So the guiding question is, first, how did these regimes work? We talked about the gold standard already a bit. So we partially know the answer to this question. But the key question today will be, what explains the stability of these regimes and how the stability varies, right? That's the key question. And if you think about our analytical framework that we developed in the third week, we thought about international factors, right? And we thought about domestic interests, and we thought about domestic institutions. So we're going to pick and choose from different levels. We're going to have theories that explain the variation using international systemic levels, and we encountered that theory actually already. And we're going to also point to domestic interests, especially government interests, and the interests of interest groups. So just a very quick reminder about the gold standard. We went through this in the first week, right? We had gold and silver standards, and then Britain moved towards a gold standard because Isaac Newton set the wrong price of gold in terms of silver. Gold was overvalued. That means that silver coin disappeared, and Britain moved de facto on a gold standard. Then, because Britain became the hegemon, everybody wanted to trade with Britain, so there was a diffusion of the gold standard around in the 1870s when Germany and France and these other countries followed. The gold standard simply means that you fix a price of gold in terms of your domestic currency. And all countries do that. That means that you can exchange your currency into another currency at a fixed price. So it's a fixed exchange rate system. That's how we should think of it. And external stability, which means the the goal to keep this exchange rate fixed has the highest priority, right? There's a high priority of external stability, which means that external stability means that the exchange rate remains fixed, and we allow for full capital mobility. That also means that we have internal adjustment, which is this adjustment mechanism that we saw on the left side here, that we compress domestic demand as outlined in the price BC gold flow, price BC flow model. Now, before 1914, that system was very stable because there was high confidence into government commitment to external stability. Nobody questioned that governments would in fact follow this internal adjustment path. Nobody questioned that. So you, as an investor or as a speculator, you knew that if there is a deficit, if a country is running a current account deficit, eventually monetary policy would start to initiate this mechanism, which means that you would increase interest rates, or the central bank should increase interest rates to speed up this adjustment mechanism. So you would actually, in anticipation of this adjustment mechanism, you would start to invest in that country. And that led to stabilizing capital flows. So speculation was actually stabilizing in that system because nobody doubted that governments are committed. After 1918, for political reasons that we're going to discuss in a moment, there were serious doubts that governments would actually follow this adjustment mechanism. So if you have doubts as a speculator that the government will keep the exchange rate fixed because it does not want to pay the political cost of this adjustment mechanism, what would you do? Well, before you started to invest in that country, right? But what's the risk now? The risk now is that you invest, the government devalues, and then you lose the value of your investment decreases, right? So now you're speculating against that country. So that leads to destabilizing political flows. So that means that for political reasons, confidence varies, and also that means that the system becomes automatically destabilizing by itself. And this is what happened. So the gold standard was restored in the 1920s. So the gold standard was given up after the Second World War. It was restored because we saw, in many countries, we saw a series of hyperinflations, Germany for instance, and one solution that was seen was to return to gold in the 1920s. And up to 1930, we had 4 countries that returned to gold, 40 countries that returned to gold. Then in 1931, Britain was one of the first countries that left the gold standard, and we're going to talk about this in a moment. And afterwards, it gradually dismantled, and by 1937, all countries left the gold standard, right? So the question now is, how could a system that was so stable for 100 years, right? How could that suddenly collapse within 7 years, right? That's the question that we need to answer here. And the answer, one answer at least, we can find this in this famous book by Karl Polanyi. It's called The Great Transformation, which was published in 1944, and it's one of the most important books in political economy and economic history. So the dependent variable, just to put this into our perspective, the dependent variable here is the stability of the international monetary system, or concretely the gold standard. So, and that variable varies, right? It was stable before, it was unstable later, right? So what are potential independent variables that come to your mind? So there must be, so there was stability before the war, so instability after the war. So there must be independent variables that also change from before the war to after the war, right? Which variables come to your mind? So we talked about a number of theories. So let's apply them, yes. So confidence, exactly. So confidence was different. So that's but then there must be a deeper variable that explains why does confidence vary. So confidence is part of our causal mechanism. So the stability varies because confidence varies. So now the question is, why does confidence vary? Yes. So we have new governments. In which way are they different? So we have new parties that are in government. And why do we have new parties in government? What happened from before the war to after the war? So we have new parties in government, and that will be part of the story. We have social democratic parties and workers' parties in government who supposedly don't like this adjustment mechanism. But why? Because they represent the workers. A key factor here is that we see democratization. We see the expansion of reform of the electoral laws in a way that we move from selective suffrage, so only a few people could vote, to universal suffrage means that a big part of citizens could vote, right? So we see democratization, which leads to, so that's exactly the causal mechanism. We see democratization, which leads to new parties in governments, which reduces confidence, which then leads to instability, right? That's a causal mechanism. That's one explanation. What other factors come to your mind? So that's a domestic politics argument, right? Yeah.
International debts between future Axis powers and especially Germany and Allied powers.
So there is an international component which is lending between. So there was the reparation payments that Germany had to do. It could not afford it, and this led to accumulation of imbalances which we could not get rid of. So that would be another explanation, an international politics explanation. So that would explain why Germany becomes unstable. It wouldn't explain why actually Britain leaves the gold standard as the first country, right? Yeah, you want to say something? So hegemony is really important, right? So we talked about that argument already in the third week. That's Charles Kindleberger's argument. I'm going to review that in a moment, exactly. Any other explanations? So we have international explanations and we have domestic explanations. So Polanyi points exactly to the same explanation. So the first one, he said, was international disintegration. We see Britain's declining position, which makes, so it was not the hegemon anymore, or it was a declining hegemon, which means that the cost of defending the gold standard for Britain just became too high. That's one argument. The second argument is domestic pressure, and this is a quote from Polanyi saying that there was an unwillingness of policymakers to subordinate questions of social organization to the needs of the restoration of the currency. So questions of social organization is a bit an outdated term for simply saying economic and social policies, right? Governments were not willing anymore to subordinate economic and social policies to the stabilization of the gold standard, right? So there was a political problem here, and we can interpret this statement in two ways. The first one is that it's all about labor interests. That's what we just discussed, and I'm gonna explain this in a moment in greater detail. But also, this could happen for different reasons, for normative reasons, because now we have a shift in economic beliefs and values, and that's all about Keynesianism, right? That we don't believe in these old ideas anymore that were underlying the gold standard, but now we have new ideas that give us an answer to the crisis that we saw in the 1930s, and that's why we want to change policy. So let's quickly review hegemony, right? That's a book by Charles Kindleberger. And he starts from the idea that international stability is a public good. Right? That was the story by Kindleberger. International stability is a public good. What's the problem of a public good? Excuse me? So there's free riding because you cannot exclude anybody from using it once it's there. That's why we need an actor who has a disproportionate interest in this public good, and that actor is the hegemon, and the hegemon then pays the cost to provide this public good. That led to, so Kindleberger made this famous statement that for the world economy to be stabilized, there has to be a stabilizer, one stabilizer, who then fulfills 5 functions. The first one is it absorbs goods that are being overproduced in the world economy. So for instance, Britain did that there was a depression in the late 19th century, and Britain started to buy up those agricultural goods that were overproduced on the European continent. And that's costly, right? You're buying up goods that you don't really need, or more than you need, which means, and Britain, by this argument, was not able to bear this cost anymore in the interwar period. Another function is counter-cyclical lending, providing a stable system of exchange rates, policy coordination, and again, being the lender of last resort. So what Kindleberger describes, what the hegemon should do, is exactly those providing the 3 tasks that I just set out at the beginning of this lecture, right? And Britain declined, and that's why the gold standard collapsed. We also talked about the critique. What's the problem with this story? We talked about this in the 3rd week. This logic raises a few questions. So one is that the US already was really strong back then, and it didn't lead. And we had the paper by Frieden, or the study by Frieden, that referred to domestic interests that prevented the United States in the interwar period to break out from isolationism. That's one. So hegemonic stability theory has its value, but it can't explain the details. So researchers turn to domestic interests and adjust the adjustment mechanism. And this is a book, Who Adjusts, it's called, by Simmons. And she actually won a prize for this being the most important book in international relations in the 1990s, or one of the most important books. So what are the adjustment interests? We already talked quickly about this. We have asset owners who get their income from returns on investments abroad or at home. And what they want is they benefit from stability. And stability is equivalent to the policies that we need under the gold standard. So they would be harmed by variation in exchange rates. They would be harmed by high inflation. So they are the ones who benefited from the gold standard, right? So what do workers want? Well, workers get their income not from returns on investments, but from employment. So if the economy is moving into recession, they are the ones who suffer. So they demand counter-cyclical fiscal and monetary policies that help them, that reduce the effects of recessions on their income. And that means they want flexibility. And flexibility is inconsistent, domestic monetary autonomy is inconsistent with the requirements of the gold standard. So this argument is actually very similar to the factor income argument in trade politics, right? In the 5th week, we talked about domestic trade politics, and we split up the economy into factors: capital, labor, and land. So this is the equivalent argument in monetary politics to the factor model in trade. It's a class argument, right? And what's important is that we see institutional change from the pre-World War I period to the post-World War I period. So before 1914, we saw very restrictive electoral rules, and voting rights were linked to either income or property. So that led to an overrepresentation of capital owners, exactly the class on the top of the left. So I'll give you an example. So in Britain, for instance, only 3.3% of the population could vote until 1884. And then there was an electoral reform, and afterwards, until the First World War, 15% of the population could vote. Exactly because the other ones didn't fulfill these income requirements and property requirements. And then after the First World War, we see a shift to universal suffrage where everybody could vote. In Denmark, for instance, in the lower chamber of the parliament, everybody was represented, but the monarch didn't have to listen to that chamber, right, to that part of the parliament. So again, they played no role. And after that, in 1918, we saw either universal male suffrage, but often also universal suffrage where everybody could vote. We eliminated the property-based rules, and parliaments were empowered. And that's the argument, at least, that led to political resistance against internal adjustment. So that's the first part, right? There's democratization, and that then that led to the second part in the causal mechanism, which is we saw an increase of labor power that then also become government parties. Here are some examples. So what you see here, this is for Belgium, what you see here is the vote share or the seat shares in parliament that different parties held in this period from 1870 to 1900, and then again the most important parties and their seat share and how it varies between 1920 and 1930. As we see here, the Catholic Party and the Liberals, and we see this pattern in all countries, we see that parliament is split between liberals, and the liberals represent capital owners and industrialists. They split power with conservative parties. And afterwards, the Workers' Party suddenly becomes important, right? And you cannot really govern without considering the interests of workers here. You have the same in Denmark. Liberals held between 60 and 75% of seats in the parliament. And afterwards, this basically is cut by half. And this other share is now picked up by the Social Democrats, right? You see that same in France, where we have the rise of socialists and radical socialists. In Germany, we have national liberals, which are totally backed by the by capital owners. And then the Social Democrats had a vote share between 20 and 30%. It's most striking in Britain. We talked about Britain a lot. So remember, the liberals played a crucial role here because we talked about how trade politics in the 19th century led to the change of the British party system. So we had the radicals from Manchester, which were backed by industrialists, and they united with the pro-free trade part of the Tories and the Whig Party, and they formed the Liberals, right? That was in the mid-19th century. So the Liberals are those people who really benefit from the gold standard. And they basically were replaced by the Labour Party, right? And we saw in the 1920s and early 1930s, we saw the Labour Party being part of the government. And that then led to the decreasing confidence in the political capacity of these governments to follow the internal adjustment mechanism. So that's one part of the explanation that Polanyi put forward, right? The other is Keynesianism, the rise of Keynesianism, the rise of new ideas how we could and should actually manage the economy or run the economy. And this is the famous book by Keynes, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, that was published in 1936 by Keynes. And so it's basically an alternative explanation to the labor interest argument that I just explained. And what Keynes did in the 1920s, he just observed the British economy and compared it to the neoclassical predictions and recommendations. And what happened was that British employment rose to about 20% in the 1920s, and it never fell below 10%. And by neoclassical economics, this unemployment rate should just have disappeared by declining wages, right? And we also saw this rising commercial competition, which means we saw those trading blocks that I already discussed in the week on preferential trade agreements that were highly competitive. So we see this trade policy being used as a political tool. And what he concluded is that internal adjustment doesn't work, and also that countries are resorting to commercial competition because they could not, the rules of the gold standard didn't allow them to use anything else to address their economic problems. So the rules were clear. The gold standard said we cannot restrict capital mobility. We have to use internal adjustment. But what the gold standard rules, the implicit rules, did not say is that it didn't say anything about trade policy. So to actually, the attempt, what governments did is they tried to reduce their trade deficits by imposing tariffs. But Keynes was a free trader. Keynes was totally in favor of free trade. So he thought he started to fight against the gold standard because he thought that the gold standard is undermining free trade, and he wanted free trade. And to achieve free trade, what he said is we need to offer something else. We need to offer, we need to prioritize internal stability, which means internal stability means we need to ensure that unemployment is low. And to do that, we need to have a policy of an autonomous rate of interest. So we should have domestic policy autonomy. We should have monetary policy autonomy. And this is inconsistent with the gold standard. As I told you before, in this adjustment mechanism, under the fixed exchange rate, the monetary policy is not independent. It's on an autopilot where the central bank just does what it needs to keep the exchange rate fixed, right? The task of the central bank is to initiate this internal adjustment mechanism, and it has no other option. So it's not autonomous. So that's what Keynes means here when he says we need the policy of an autonomous interest rate. We need to have monetary policy that is deviating from the rules of the gold standard. And we need a national investment program directed to an optimum level of domestic employment. So the goal of the government is not to keep the exchange rate fixed, but to reduce unemployment. And he says that will help ourselves and also our neighbors because we're not in a competition with them anymore. That's what this all means here. So the point is that we had a crisis of the system, and Keynes comes in, that's the story, Keynes comes in and offers a new solution. And then governments start to follow this solution. That's the alternative story. There's again a problem with this story. What of that what I just told you contradicts this story? So this book was published in 1936, but Britain left the gold standard in 1931. And nobody wanted to listen to Keynes, right? So what really happened, that's one argument, is that governments didn't believe Keynes, and they didn't follow his advice, but they were pushed out of the gold standard for other reasons, and then they were in a crisis, and then they turned to Keynes because he offered a solution to their new situation, right? So Keynes in ideas did not lead to the to the collapse of the gold standard. But once the gold standard collapsed, these ideas provided a theoretical framework how we should act under this new situation. So we made sense of it using Keynes's idea. So they are not a cause of the collapse of the gold standard, but they explain why later on we see the new system and why it looks the way it did. So I'm going to talk about the implementation of these ideas in a moment after the break. Before that, I just want to quickly give you the critique of this story, of both arguments actually. So Britain, and this is a paper by James Morrison, and one problem with Keynesianism as a key determinant of the collapse is that it only came later. The problem with the class-based argument and the claim that labor resisted these policies, the gold standard, is that if you actually look at what the Labour Party wanted and what they believed, this is not the case. So here's a statement by Philip Snowden, who was a Labour politician. He was in government in the 1920s. He was again in government. Labour won the election in 1930. He was in government, in a national government. He was the finance minister in a government of some Labour politicians who were then excluded from Labour for that reason, and some Tories and other parties. But what he said is that we should not get off the gold standard, because the standard of living of the workmen would be reduced by 50% if we departed from the gold standard. So many people in labor unions and in the Labour Party were actually not opposed to the gold standard. So that contradicts this argument that it's all about democratization and it's about the rise of labor power. So that's what Morrison says. And what he then describes is Britain's departure from the gold standard more or less as an accident. And it's all about the Bank of England, where we had two factions. So there was the Governor Norman, who wanted to, in 1931, or 1930, 1931, he wanted to raise the interest rate right after the Great Depression to stabilize the gold standard. So he wanted to pursue this orthodox economic policy and prioritize external stability over internal stability. There was a faction in the central bank around the deputy governor, Harvey, that opposed this because they thought that if you increase interest rate, it undermines confidence because everybody knows that the government would not be able to sustain this politically in the future. So he was opposed to that. And as it happens, the Norman got a nervous breakdown and he turned ill. So he had to leave the bank. He went to the US. That's the story Morrison is telling. He went to the US to recover. And he had so he talked to the people at the American Federal Reserve Bank, which is the American central bank, and they told him that Harvey actually did not want to raise interest rates and was more skeptical about the gold standard and maintaining the gold standard. So he got angry, and he rushed back to Britain to prevent this and to change policy. Harvey heard about this, and what he said was, what he thought they should do is, they should go temporarily off the gold standard to let things come down. that would postpone the upcoming election, and he hoped that the current government could stay in power, and then they would restore the gold standard, and then we would go on. So Norman comes back, it's too late, Harvey already suspended gold standard. So that's what he says. So Harvey temporarily suspends gold convertibility in September 1931. So it was one of the first countries, and the situation was not at all worse economically for labor than in the parts of the 1920s. So what we had is a 30% depreciation of the British pounds, but all those predictions that we now would have hyperinflation, that the economy would collapse, all the experiences of the 1920s did not materialize. They did not happen. So they suddenly saw, oh, we can live without the gold standard, and we can actually do pretty well without the gold standard. So it was, by this story, it was just an accident. And then we re-invoked Keynes' ideas to actually now guide monetary policy, because we needed a new theoretical framework that made sense of all this, right? And then we can see how, in the government, policymakers started to learn how this new system would work. So this is a internal memorandum by one key policymakers in the finance department, that saying that it is our intention to take the steps which will most surely tend to stabilize the pound on a definite basis, but before definitely binding the economy by obligations, by external obligations, by returning to gold standard, right? We want to ensure ourselves that there is no doubt as to our permanent ability to maintain this position taken up. So that means basically, oh, let's just wait a bit and see how things go, and then we learn, then we move gradually towards this new system, right? So the point here is that we have these big mechanisms in the background. We have hegemonic decline, we have democratization, we have new ideas, but they themselves did not necessarily cause this particular instance where Britain went off gold, but instead they worked as factors in the background, but the specific decision to go off gold was more an accident, and then we moved on in this new system, right? And trying to reconcile democracy with monetary policy and the new situation in the world economy. Before we go into the break, I want to say one thing. So this gold standard talk might be sound a bit outdated to you. But think about it this way. The gold standard, or more generally, this fixed exchange rate and the necessity of internal adjustment is based on undemocratic politics, right? It only works. That's the implication of this argument, of the domestic interest argument. It only works if parts of the population are excluded from political representation. So it's based on undemocratic politics, because we need to impose costs on this part of the population to make it work. Now that should remind you of something that you see today. What does it remind you of? Yes? So this is the story of Greece in an extreme, well, Greece is more extreme, right? But think of the Eurozone as a fixed exchange rate system, right? Just as the gold standard. That's why it's basically, if you have an imbalance within the Eurozone, so if Greece is running a huge current account deficit, is accumulating debt, then you need to adjust internally. You can't devalue. And internal adjustment is at least in parts based on undemocratic politics, right? And to some extent, that's what you see in Greece, right? The Greek population voted against austerity, which is a form of internal adjustment, and it was overruled and it was still imposed on them, right? So what you learn, if you think the gold standard is old, that's true, but what happened in the gold standard is highly relevant for the Eurozone today. It's exactly the same story behind it, right? That's what you should keep in mind when you think about these old events. But let's take a 15-minute break, come back at 11:20, and then we're going to move into the Bretton Woods system. Okay, let's get started again. Good. So all these experiences with the gold standard led to a new system, which is the Bretton Woods system. So I'm quickly going to review its key feature, and then I'm going to explain it and discuss why it looked the way it did. But John Maynard Keynes had a great influence on how it looked like, because he was one of those people who designed it. So this was the first international monetary system that actually was designed. So the gold standard just evolved over time. It was not designed by, based on specific ideas, but this system was designed. And the negotiator on the American side was Harry Dexter White. And Keynes traveled to the United States the first time in 1941 when, so Keynes now was very important, right? He became an advisor of the British government. And he traveled to the US in 1941 because he negotiated an agreement between the US and the UK that specified how the US is helping the UK in its, during the war, the so-called Land-Lease Agreement. And in the context of these negotiations, they talked about how the new monetary system after the war should look like. And this led to this conference in a town called Bretton Woods in 1944, and that's why it's called the Bretton Woods system. And it's characterized first by a fixed exchange rate, but this, unlike the gold standard, this fixed exchange rate is not fully fixed, but it can be adjusted, which is another way of saying that the government can devalue its exchange rate after, under certain circumstances. So that allows for the flexibility that Keynes always wanted. So it's still a fixed exchange rate system because there was a belief that fixed exchange rates are useful for trade, but they also are harmful if they constrain domestic economy too much, so it's a compromise. It's a gold-dollar standard, which means that the currencies are not all currencies are connected to gold directly, but the US dollar is connected to gold at a fixed price, and the motivation was simply that the US at that time was holding way much more gold reserves than all the other countries, and then the other countries would be fixed to the dollar. And there's gold convertibility, which means that the US always ensures that if you come to the US Federal Reserve Bank with a certain amount of dollars, they always ensure that they would give you an equivalent amount of gold in exchange. So that's gold convertibility. We have capital controls, so capital flows, international capital flows were highly restricted, and the goal is to ensure domestic autonomy, right? And then we have this new feature, which is based on an idea from Keynes. We have international financing, so if a country is running imbalances and is facing a crisis, then we would have this international institution to step in and lend money to this country, and that's the IMF. So this international financing, that's the IMF. This goes back to an idea by Keynes. He called it the International Clearing Union, which in his vision would have been much more powerful than the IMF. So the IMF is an outcome of a compromise between the US and Keynes's view, because the US was not so fond of having such a strong international institution that would interfere too much with the domestic affairs of the United States. So the IMF actually, as you know it today, looked very differently when it was established. It was a Keynesian institution. So the IMF does not have a reputation of being very Keynesian these days, right? But back then, it was fully Keynesian. And then adjustment would be symmetric, which means both the deficit country and the surplus countries would coordinate their policies in a way that both together eliminate the imbalance, which means the surplus country would also take actions, would become more expansionary, and loosen its monetary policy to reduce its surplus. So that's at least an idea. And if this doesn't work, there can be external adjustment, which means we can devalue the exchange rate if, and that's the rule, there's a fundamental disequilibrium. So there's a rule, but what a fundamental disequilibrium is not specified. So in some ways, this rule is very vague. So this system was, in the early years, was actually fairly unstable because the European countries were still way too weak, and their exchange rate, they could not keep the exchange rate fixed because the dollar was too strong. So Britain had to opt out of the system right after it entered the system. Then it went out for a while, and the European economy stabilized. There was a Marshall Plan, and part of the ideas behind the Marshall Plan was to stabilize the system, and by the late 1950s it worked. But fairly quickly it's destabilized again, but for a different reason. Now the US was running a trade deficit, and there was an excess amount, or there were too many dollars in the international system. I'm going to go through this in a moment. It's a so-called dollar glut. And there were more and more conflicts, political conflicts over this, the behavior of, or the policy that the United States was pursuing. So there's this statement by the French government, some say it was Charles de Gaulle who said it, some say it was Giscard d'Estaing who said it, that they complained about the United States having an exorbitant privilege because they were a country that would provide the key reserve currency, the US dollar. All the international exchange was done in US dollars, and because everybody needed to the US dollar, the only country that did not have to follow, did not have to restrain its monetary policy and had full autonomy was the US. So that was the exorbitant privilege which the French government objected against. So the system collapsed in the early 1970s when Nixon, who was the US president, closed the so-called gold window, which basically means he suspended gold convertibility that I just described. He said, we are not going to exchange US dollars into gold anymore at this fixed price. That's over. So he was closing the gold window. So there was then negotiations how to deal with this new situation, and that led to the so-called Smithsonian Agreement that specified what the countries should do to save the Bretton Woods systems. And Nixon said, it's the greatest monetary arrangement in the history of the world, and it collapsed in 1973. And it collapsed when Switzerland actually started to float the exchange rate and basically opted out of the system, and that was in March 1973, and Germany followed a few months later. So again, we can rely on neoliberal institutionalism to explain that. And in the third week, I have a slide on the IMF and what it does to prevent competitive devaluations, which was one of the problems in the in the 1930s. So if you start from the idea that a basic model where you have two countries that can either keep the exchange rate fixed or devalue, and you assume a kind of political economy or neo-mercantilist preference order, then you end up with a prisoner's dilemma. And to solve the problems, the free-riding situation in prisoner's dilemma, you establish an international institution which provides information about whether the other countries follow the rules. And that's what the IMF does. So I talked about this in week 3. You've got the slide. Look at that again. Another explanation refers again to the underlying norms and the negotiations between the United States and the UK. So the system, the Bretton Woods system, is often called a system of embedded liberalism. Embedded liberalism means that you have a liberal system, an open world economy, but at the same time it's embedded in the idea that you need domestic autonomy. So this term is from a paper by Ruggie, John Gerard Ruggie, from 1982, which is one of the most important studies in international relations. It's called International Regimes, Transactions and Change, Embedded Liberalism in the Post-War Economic Order. So this is one of the most important papers about international regime theory. So I assume you heard about international regime theory in your previous courses. So how did we end up with this embedded liberalism? So the US position in these negotiations was that they wanted to have an open trading system, and they wanted to have a multilateral trading system as we know it today. The UK position was that they cared a lot about full employment. So right, that's Keynes's idea. They wanted international stability, but they still insisted on this imperial preference system that I discussed a few weeks ago. We had the Ottawa Conference in 1932 where they established this the imperial preference system that favored the Commonwealth countries in their trade with Britain and discriminated against the others. They wanted that initially, and Keynes also wanted that when he came to the US for the first time in 1941, but then he relaxed his position, and we ended up with this compromise where, unlike in the 1930s, the order is multilateral, right? In the 1930s, the world order was that we had several political blocs. So we have this new world order, and unlike the gold standard, it allows for domestic interventionism. That's embedded liberalism. And the one explanation here is that we have sometimes in the history of the international system, we have critical junctures. So that's the argument by Eikenberry, and you read the paper by Morrison in the second week of this course, and he refers actually to the same logic. So when a system is what experts say actually has very little influence on what policymakers do, except in those few instances where the system is in a crisis and nobody knows what we should do. And that's when expert consensus in this breakpoint allows for new ideas to influence the policy-making process because we need to find new solutions. And Eikenberry says this collapse of the old system in the 1930s and the necessity to reconstruct it was such a breakpoint in international history where experts, in this context Keynes, had the opportunity to provide his ideas and influence how the new system would look like. So to see how these norms were actually, how they looked like, we can turn to the IMF Charter. You can go online on the IMF website and you can read the Charter of the IMF. And what you will see is all these ideas that I just described. So the first one is that the IMF Charter refers explicitly to the purpose of the IMF is, and I'm quoting here, to facilitate the expansion and balanced growth of international trade. So that's in Article 1. But also to contribute thereby to the promotion and maintenance of high levels of employment. So employment now is really crucial. And in a later article, it explicitly refers to domestic autonomy. So that's what you still have in the Charter of the IMF. It specifies that we should have a system of public international finance, which means that governments control international capital flows. So governments should allow international capital flows to the extent that they are necessary to encourage trade. Because you need to pay for what you buy abroad, right? So you need international capital flows. But apart from that, this is all controlled by governments. We have symmetric adjustment. I described this a moment ago, that both the surplus and the deficit country should allow for adjustment or should bear adjustment costs. So again, if we refer to the Eurozone, that's totally not the case. Adjustment is imposed on the deficit countries. So adjustment costs are borne by Ireland, by Spain, by Greece, and Portugal, right? But not by Germany. Germany would be the surplus country, and Germany should, by this rule, be more expansionary and relax its fiscal policy, but it doesn't. And monetary stability. So the specific rules are, you find them still in the IMF Charter, fixed but adjustable exchange rate, adjustment if there's a fundamental disequilibrium. It allows for capital controls, emergency lending, and surveillance, right? So read through the IMF Charter and you will find all these Keynesian ideas in there. Now the IMF today looks very different, so it's not important for the Bretton Woods system, but just to give you an understanding why the IMF became the IMF as it is today. So the Bretton Woods system broke down and the IMF was a bit lost. So they were searching for new tasks, and actually the key powers at the time, they started to circumvent the IMF. They already did it before that. So the Marshall Fund is actually a unilateral American program which doesn't work through the IMF, but it basically went around the IMF, right? Now they started to do this more and more. And that's the time when the G meetings, the G7, emerged. So the first G meeting was in 1975 to actually discuss how this new system, after the collapse of the Bretton Woods, should actually be organized. So the key powers were circumventing the IMF. The IMF didn't really know what to do. Then there was the Latin American debt crisis. And that's when this IMF stepped in and reorganized its activities and started to become a debt manager, right, or international debt manager. Then in the 1990s, we saw the post-communist transitions, and the IMF then assumed the role of helping the countries and providing expertise in these transitions. Then we saw the Asian financial crisis and a series of emerging market crises where it again became a crisis manager with a totally different ideological background as it had before, right? And there's a lot of research that discusses how the IMF became the way it looks today. And we have the European crisis where now it actually starts to become a bit more relaxed and less orthodox than it used to be in these previous crises, right? So if you think about the negotiations between in the Troika, the so-called Troika, the EU Commission, the ECB, and the IMF, when it was about lending and the conditions that were offered to Greece for getting money, the IMF was actually much more relaxed about the conditions than some European countries. Right, so there's a somewhat a rethinking of the IMF's policy in the fund. So the fund reinvented itself again and again, first as a sovereign debt manager, then a capital account crisis manager, then for economic transitions, and it started to move more and more into the direction of imposing conditions on governments how to implement structural reforms. So let's get back to the Bretton Woods system. So the Bretton Woods system collapsed because the United States was having was following a monetary policy that was more and more expansionary, which led to a trade deficit. So this is the US current account from 1960 to 1975, and you can see that until 1966, it was actually all fine, the current account was positive, and then gradually we see a decline, and if you just look at the trade balance, it turned negative already earlier. Then we see a slight turnaround in 1970. This is when Nixon comes into office. He tried to save the Bretton Woods system initially. So he came into office in 1979, but then he gave up, actually. He turned around and suspended gold convertibility here at this point when the current account became negative. So after the Bretton Woods system collapsed, that's the vertical line here, the current account of the US turned positive, at least for a while. So why is that a problem here? What's the problem with the current account of the US? Well, it led to the shrinking of gold, that's all these policies, the expansionary policies of the US led to so the amount of dollars in the world economy was growing. So if you print more money, that's a simple story. You print more money, there's more dollars, and these dollars should be backed by gold, right? That's how the system was designed. Now, gold, the amount of gold is also slightly increasing. If you find gold, right, there's more gold, but the amount of gold was growing less quickly than the amount of dollars. So, less and less dollars were backed by gold. But in 1950, about 20% of the amount of dollars that were in circulation were backed by gold. Gold that was held by the Federal Reserve Bank. And that percentage was shrinking. So in 1968, only 5% were backed by gold. So to keep that system working, what the other countries had to do, so Germany, Switzerland, France, they had to absorb these dollars, right? They had to buy up these dollars to keep the system stable. So the German government was accumulating more and more dollars and was holding more and more dollars as reserves. And so in that time, at the end of the Bretton Woods system, foreign governments were holding about 14 billion US dollars, and the US government had about 13.8 billion had about $13.8 billion in terms of gold. But that was only a fraction because that didn't count in the amount of dollars that were still in circulation in the United States. So what's the problem here? What's the problem for the gold price and confidence? Where you expect that eventually the United States would have to revalue the price of gold. So gold should become more expensive, right? So you don't believe in this system anymore. So there was speculation against this system, against the fixed rate of exchange between gold and dollars. So there's an economic problem or a dilemma behind all this. This is a Belgian economist who formulated this dilemma. And it goes back to so that's the economic background here. I'm going to add politics in a moment. This is a driven dilemma. So there's competing goals. As I said at the very beginning, the system there must be enough liquidity. So, and that's provided by providing US dollars to the international system, right? So the American government should provide extra dollars to the world economy to avoid a shortage of liquidity in the world economy. So that is actually implemented by running a current account deficit because that leads to an outflow of dollars into the world economy, right? But then that was the first task, liquidity. The second task was confidence. Now confidence was declining, as I just said, because you knew that you could not, the American government would eventually have to revalue the price of gold in terms of dollars. So to reduce the supply of, to stabilize the gold price, the US government would have to reduce the supply of dollars. That would require that it runs a current account surplus to basically reattract the dollars in the world economy back into the country, right? So that leads to incompeting goals. So this doesn't work, right? That's the structural problem of the system that's working in the background. But it still doesn't explain the politics of the other countries in certain ways. So one key factor that was playing in, and that we need to look at why the system kept dragging on for so long, and why countries accepted that the US would run such a big would run a deficit, is the security environment in the 1960s. So how how do military concerns play into the current account? How is military aid, where does it show up in the current account? So the current account is the trade balance plus returns from investments abroad plus transfers, and military aid is a transfer. So if you station troops in Germany as American government, that means money is flowing out of the country, right? So that was part of the, that was at least part of the story. So forced, so there was this stick that the US government had. They would say, well, right, I mean, it's partially because of our aid to you, so what's your problem, right? So you have to pay the cost in terms of absorbing excess US dollars, which might lead to higher inflation in your country, but nonetheless, that's what you have to do. So there was an increasing conflict where the French government threatened to convert its dollars into gold. And if they had done that, and if Germany had done that, right, then the system would have collapsed immediately. Because the US government did not have enough gold to actually pay out, to exchange dollars into gold. So, but if the French threatened to do this, everybody had an incentive to be the first one, because if you're the first one, you still get the gold, and if you're the second one, the gold is gone, right? And your dollars are worth nothing. So there's this dilemma here. Now, the American government had this leverage over the German government simply because it provided protection to Germany. So the French, of course, understood this. So there was this attempt by Charles de Gaulle and his government in the 1960s to actually reduce the power of the US government over, it's not just Germany, but also the UK and Japan, by offering nuclear protection to Germany. So that was one attempt, that was an offer that was highly politicized in the 1960s. Germany rejected it. Now the problem here was that the French missiles, actually, the French nuclear missiles, they wouldn't fly very far. They could only fly to Germany. So that offer was not very credible, but anyway. That was an attempt which failed. But nonetheless, so you can see how monetary and security policies play together here in this period. And that led to this, so there was concerns that Germany would actually give in. And that led to this reassurance of the Bundesbank to the US government that they would not convert their dollar holdings into gold. And that's an exceptional step, right? Think of the Bundesbank. The Bundesbank perceives itself as being a technocratic institution that has nothing to do with politics. At least that's one way to look at it. But what they did here is, so you can't read it, so I'm gonna quote from this letter. So this is the chairman of the Bundesbank writing a letter to the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank, saying that you are, of course, well aware of the fact that the Bundesbank over the past few years has not converted any of the dollar accruing out of German foreign exchange surpluses into gold from the United States. And by refraining from converting dollars into gold, the Bundesbank has intended to contribute to international monetary cooperation, and you may be assured that also in the future the Bundesbank intends to continue this policy and never do anything that disturbs the international monetary system, right? So that's a pretty, and they explicitly refer to the US military aid and so on. So that's a pretty unusual step. You can look at this yourself. If you click on this link here, down here, there's a link. If you click on that, you will be redirected to the website of the Bundesbank that in detail describes this letter and why it was done and so on and so forth, right? So there's security concerns that affect why the system worked on in the 1960s. But it eventually collapsed because inflation was growing and growing and growing in Germany. The German government was more and more opposed to it. And then there was the international, the international détente. So there was a movement towards less conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States, and that to some extent alleviated German concerns about its security. The threat of a nuclear war was not as big anymore as it used to be before, and that also factored in when the German government decided not to continue with the system. Good, so that's the explanation of the German approach in the 1960s. Nonetheless, the system collapsed in 1971. So that raises the question, why did Nixon close the gold window? And here, we really need to look at politics. And the background here is that Nixon was the vice president in the 1950s. And he wanted to become president in 1960, in the election in 1960. So he was running against Kennedy, and he lost. And he was the vice president at the time, so he was associated with the economic conditions at the time. And what happened in the before the 1960 election was that unemployment was growing. So Nixon was held accountable for rising unemployment, and we're going to discuss next week how the state of the economy strongly influences voting behavior. So Nixon was not elected, and he was totally convinced that he was not elected. He lost the election against Kennedy because of the economy, right? So Nixon was then elected finally in 1968, and he was facing re-election in 1972. So you can already see the correlation between his policies and this, and the decision to give up gold convertibility and this election. So the assumption here is that voters vote for the incumbent candidate if the economy is doing well. And I'm going to show you a relationship next week, and this relationship is actually very strong. There's a second assumption, which is the so-called Phillips curve. And we're going to criticize that Phillips curve next week. But there's the idea that you can reduce unemployment by increasing inflation. And this is the Phillips curve in practice in the 1960s. So in 1960, this was when Nixon was not elected, unemployment was 6.5%. And then monetary policy was such that the inflation increased, right? That's the inflation rate, that's the unemployment rate. And you can see 1962, 1963, 64, 65, 66, 67, 68, 69. In 1969, we have low unemployment, but a high inflation rate. So that's the high inflation rate which causes problems to the, so we have a high inflation rate because we have an expansionary monetary policy, and the solution to save the Bretton Woods system would be to reduce inflation, but Nixon then anticipated that unemployment would go up. So he sits in the Oval Office and has the choice between saving the system and probably losing re-election, or that was his fear, or letting the system go and get re-elected, and he opted for the second option. And so he suspended gold convertibility because he was not willing to change his monetary policy or his economic policy, and that then led to the collapse of the system. There's an alternative explanation which goes a bit deeper again, and that again refers to norms. So to explain the collapse of one explanation for the collapse of the gold standard is to refer to Keynesian norms. So it would be natural to explain the collapse of the Bretton Woods system with new norms. And this norm would be monetarism, which is the Phillips curve has been highly criticized. With this approach now, which is associated with the name of Milton Friedman, says monetary policy is ineffective to manage the economy, at least in the long term. So we should just focus on money supply and not on demand. We should just restrict money supply and keep inflation low. But what Best says, Jacqueline Best wrote this paper where she says, well, that's not the only story. There wasn't just monetarism, but also those people who were seen as neo-Keynesians. So there's a big school which tried to synthesize Keynesian ideas with the classical economics theory. So they reformulated Keynesianism and interpreted the problems of the Bretton Woods system through a neoclassical framework. They still focus on the demand side, but what the outcome was is that they actually departed from Keynes in essential ways. So they departed from the idea that expectations and probabilities that economic actors have were based on group norms. And instead they thought there's an objective, or that's an assumption in this framework, that there's an objective probability that you could derive by looking at about expectations and therefore also investment, right? But Keynes said there's intersubjectiveness of economic decisions. There's no such objective expectation. But by believing this, there was a tendency to search for technical fixes. So you would establish a gold pool in the 1960s where the UK and the US jointly managed the gold market. You have other rules which only address the symptoms but not the causes, the underlying causes of the destabilization of the Bretton Woods system. So that's an alternative argument that's also out there that explains the the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. I'll go over this, I'll quickly do this. So once the system collapsed, we had this what we could call a legalization of the new system, where France still insisted on a fixed exchange rate system, so it wanted to have a system of stable rates, and the US didn't want that anymore. So at the G5 meeting at the Rambouillet Castle in France, they agreed on a face-saving compromise where they changed the charters to say that there should be a stable system of exchange rates instead of a system of stable exchange rates, right? That's a different thing. So they moved away from stable exchange rates to a stable system, which basically means you can do whatever you want. And now we have a system where countries pick and choose which exchange rate system they want. And sometimes this is highly politicized. So in the 1970s and 80s, we saw a lot of political conflict between the big powers that were driven by exchange rates and by current accounts. So we have a series of G meetings, and this famous paper in international relations by Robert Putnam on two-level games, right? This all talks about the Bonn summit here, the G7 meeting in Bonn in 1977, how there was a conflict between Japan and Germany on the one hand, and the United States on the other hand, and how this was driven by concerns about domestic politics. But there's periods when the exchange rate is actually not very politicized. And in the 1990s, there was a slight undervaluation of the US dollar, but nobody cared too much, right? So there was a question, George Bush was the senior George Bush. He was asked the question, so, the dollar is undervalued, what should we do about it? And he responded, well, once in a while I think about those things, but not too much. And now exchange rates are highly politicized again. This is a statement by the Brazilian finance minister in 2010 that he saw the world in a currency war. We're going to talk a bit more about Switzerland, right? Switzerland is a great example because the Swiss exchange rate for a long time wasn't a big deal, right? But now, and at least in the past few years, it was highly politicized what the Swiss National Bank is doing or should do. So I'll explain this graph next week. Now the question is, who chooses a fixed exchange rate, who chooses a flexible exchange rate? That's what we're going to discuss next week. I just want to show you one more thing. So this is the graph I showed you a while ago, a few moments ago. This is the US current account from 1960 to 1965, right? You saw that picture. That was turning negative and led to the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. This is how it looks today. So that's just to give you some idea how we moved, how our system has changed from the Bretton Woods system, right? So back then, this led to the collapse, and now we're here. Good. I'll see you next week to talk more about this.